Okay, so we are looking at knowledge representation, and so far we have not paid too much attention to what are the predicates that we will choose for representing certain facts. So, we have happily chosen predicates like man, mortal, and whatever you need for the thing, because we have focused more on the reasoning part essentially. So, I want to spend a few lectures looking at representation, and it is an effort which was done, as you can see in this slide, by at Yale University under the supervision of Roger Schank. There was a, over a period of close to 10 years, there were something like 15 PhD students who implemented all this stuff. Their goal was to understand natural language stories and be able to reason about them. So, the question is, what do you mean by understanding natural language stories? What we will take that to be here is that you should be able to map into some logical representation. So, if you have a set of predicates for representing certain facts, then if you can map the sentences onto that representation, then you have in some sense understood what the sentence means, and then based on that you can answer some questions and things like that essentially. So, their theory is called conceptual dependency theory, also known as CD theory, and we will spend a few lectures looking at that. And this was done quite long ago, before most of you were born, and but it is a very interesting piece of work, because it goes to what you might call as deep semantics or the semantics of language essentially. Nowadays, it is more fashionable to do surface level processing. So, you have text analytics and you have everything which does looks at a lot of text and applies lot of algorithms to try to figure out various kind of things. Whereas, this approach was towards creating a canonical representation of whatever you are talking about essentially. So, we are looking at this problem of perception or understanding. This is a problem which is not just in natural language, but in vision and speech and even touch, you might say, that whenever you get input from some sense into your system, how do you make sense of, how do you understand that input essentially. Okay. So, we will be focusing on natural language understanding. So, understanding is a little bit like parsing essentially, right. You can process word by word, you can do something with some representation which stands for the meaning of the word and things like that. But one thesis which this group puts forward and which we will also look at is that understanding is a top down process. It is not a bottom up process, in the sense that you do not take in the words, put them together and then somehow make sense of the meaning. But it is rather that you have a lot of knowledge into your head in your head, which helps you to understand what is coming in. So, understanding is like trying to fit the incoming information into existing knowledge representation into your system essentially. And this is a theory which has been increasingly adopted not only in natural language, but even in places like vision essentially. So, in vision it is not that you process the pixels, then you extract the patterns, then you extract the edges and then you extract objects and then you make sense of the scene. It is rather that you are expecting to see something and you try to best match what is coming in terms of what you think you are seeing essentially. So, very interesting hypothesis. So, it involves concept driven mapping into preconceived notions as written here, rather than data driven bottom up approach essentially. So, we will start with a short story. I will ask you to read this story. So, as you can see, there is one angry young man called John here. Now, you as a reader of this story or as a listener of this story, at this point we have stopped telling you the story, but you have certain expectations that you have in your head as to what is it that you will follow next essentially. Okay. Where do these expectations come from? They come from existing knowledge into your head essentially. So, you already know how people behave and that kind of stuff. So, based on that you have certain expectations. So, this story I have taken from this article called Identification of Conceptualizations Underlying Natural Language by Roger Schank. So, what are the expectations that we have? We get expectations from various sources essentially. So, first of all we may have from a knowledge of syntax of the language that we expect a verb to appear after that. So, from the our knowledge of meaning we expect that okay, he is going to talk about something which we will call as a conceptual structure, which is what we will be looking at essentially. In terms of context, we can expect that he is going to talk about an action essentially. Okay. So, it limit the context will kind of delimit the range of actions that you expect to hear essentially. So, for example, you might say end relation or hurt someone or go to some plate or just emote or something like that essentially. From the conversational perspective, we know that people talk for a certain reason essentially, maybe to arouse sympathy or to inform you about their intent or maybe to get votes or whatever, depending on what the context is. You always have certain purpose, intention behind communications. In fact, there is a whole book which I could show you, which is simply called Intentions in Communication essentially. Then the worldview of the listener essentially. Do you know that John is a convicted murderer, for example, then you would expect something like that from him, or if he is known to be an pacifist, then you would expect something milder from him. So, these are all the sources of expectations that you have at the point where we stop listening at the story essentially. Also the culture. So, in different cultures people do things differently essentially. So, that will also generate an expectation essentially. So, our question is what kind of knowledge representation or knowledge structures in the memory of the problem solving agent would generate such expectations, and if you can generate such expectations, we will have some handle on trying to understand story essentially. Today we will focus more on the representation, but a little bit later when we looked at structured knowledge representations and things like frames, we will come back to Schank's work and look at something which he calls as scripts essentially. So, here is a story and here what you were thinking, I think I ought to, and if you were to hear I think I ought to go and eat some fish, then you would be really surprised, because that does not meet your expectation essentially. And in fact, such violation of expectation is the foundation or the basis on which jokes are told essentially. So, you start telling something and the listener builds up some expectation and suddenly that is violated, maybe which you find funny also, but because you find it, you find something suddenly it strikes you as something which is funny, and it is based on violation of expectations essentially. So, at this point I will want to show you a couple of movies. Oops, I started it already. Anyway, the point of the movie was that okay, let me just minimize it. The point of the movie was that if you can just look at those dots which are there on this page, then of course, after having seen the movie you know that we are talking about a person, but if you were to simply look at the dots, then there is no way of I mean you might guess that it represents a person or something or that, but when those dots start moving as was happening in the movie, then you can see that the oops, I keep messing up things. How do I stop that? Now, how do I stop this? So, I want to actually stop this and
Press space bar.
Hmm. Too many gadgets. I think, huh? So, both these movies I got from somebody called Richard Gregory. Maybe I'll mention it once I start this thing, and who was visiting IIT, and he works in design and this thing. So, so if you just look at this set of dots, they probably do not mean anything. They could mean a constellation of stars or something like that. It's very difficult to say what it stands for essentially. But the moment we animate these dots, that they start moving, then you start seeing a person essentially. Now, the fact that you are seeing a person is obviously not a bottom up process. It is not the dots which are somehow being converted into a person. It is the fact that somehow that combination of movement of dots triggers the notion of a person in your head, and you seeing that. So, the idea that this is a person is really in your head and not so much in the dots themselves. So, the other film is even more stronger in this perception, and so you see the name here, Richard Gregory. He is the person who gave me these two films, and he made them, of course. So, this other film is about this, what should I say, statue or mask of Charlie Chaplin. I am sure you all know Charlie Chaplin. This is even more striking in the fact that what you think you are seeing is constrained in a significant manner by what is there in your head essentially. So, I will let you see the movie, and then maybe we will discuss it again. Okay, let's watch it like this.
Actually a hollow mask. It appears to rotate in the opposite direction, and amazing that the nose sticks out, although it's actually sticking in. Coming round now is
so you see,
normal.
your brain is controlling what you are seeing. Okay. So, as Professor Gregory was saying, simply because you have seen so many faces that you know that this is how a face is a convex object in which the nose sticks out, you are unable to see it as a hollow face at all, and however hard you try, and maybe you can see this movie again and again, it is really very difficult to try to see it as a hollow face. And it really, as he himself also said, it emphasizes the fact that it is a top down knowledge that we have in our head about faces, which really determines as to what do we think we are seeing essentially. Okay. So, coming back to more prosaic things, which is we are looking at this conceptual dependency theory or the CD theory. It defines a semantic base for natural language. The objective was, when they designed it, to understand natural language stories. It is designed for everyday actions. Okay. Now, what CD theory is, as far as we are concerned, is essentially a choice of predicates, and what is interesting about CD theory is that it is a choice of a small set of predicates, depending on two different sets that they talk about. It is either 11 predicates or 14 predicates, which they use for basic CD theory. But of course, there are other things like states that we will talk about this thing. So, more specific domains may require more specific set of this thing. Okay. So, the basic unit in CD theory is called a conceptualization. It is something like a well formed formula in first order logic, and the main component of a conceptualization is an event, which is defined by an actor, an action, an object, and a sense of direction essentially. So, conceptualizations are made up of concepts and relations between concepts, which is what logic is all about, right. You have categories and relations between categories essentially. Now, in CD theory, the concepts are of different types. One is called nominals, which are basically correspond to nouns in our language, and they call it picture producers essentially. So, we will use the term PP or picture producers for nominals. Then we have actions, which correspond to conceptually what are actions like eating, drinking, and so on and so forth. Then there are modifiers. So, there are two kinds of modifiers: action aiders AAs and picture aiders PA. They correspond roughly to adverbs and verbs respectively. So, action aiders may describe the action in a little bit more detail. So, for example, instead of saying he ran to the canteen, you can say he ran fast to the canteen. So, that fast is an adverb that you are using here essentially. Picture aiders are likewise adjectives, and they may describe something, help describe something in a little bit more detail essentially. The nominals and the actions are governing categories. These are linguistic terms. So, if you have studied linguistics, you would talk about governing and dependent categories. Governing categories are those which can stand alone by themselves, whereas dependent categories need a governing category to make sense essentially. So, let us look at conceptualization. So, nominals and actions can exist as independent notions, as we have just said. Nominals stand for objects and people. Actions are acts which are of nominals. Modifiers give additional information on the nominals or actions. A dependent concept predicts the existence of a governor. Remember, we are talking about predictions essentially, expectations, generating expectations. What do you predict you will hear next essentially, or what should go into the sentence and things like that. A conceptualization is a two-way dependency. It is a collection of concepts and relations in which there is a two-way dependency, that both are needed to explain what is happening essentially. It tells you something about the world, and the CD theory defines a set of actions that can be done by people, and it can be described in a logic like syntax. So, for example, if you look up the book by Charniak and McDermott on artificial intelligence, they have described CD theory in the kind of syntax that we talked about when we were looking at unification algorithm. Or it can be developed by C diagrams or concept diagrams, which is what we will do, which is what we will borrow from what Shank and his group did essentially. So, essentially some sort of a graphical notation. So, let us start with a simple sentence. John hit his little dog essentially. How do we make sense of this? So, parsing these sentences, as we will see towards at some later point, you just assume that you are reading the sentence from left to right, and you parse it bit by bit essentially. So, or word by word essentially. So, John is a picture producer. It can be understood by a picture producer, can be understood by itself. So, we know what John stands for, a concept, and we know hit, for example, stands for some action essentially. And between, so when you say John hit, then we have some story going on, or something is happening essentially, an event is happening, a two-way dependency. So, that is a core of the conceptualization essentially. Then the dog is also a picture producer, but it can be understood only in relation to the conceptualization that we are building essentially, and the relation is called objective dependency, and it is a fact that dog is the object of the action essentially. So, we represent this in this fashion, that John hit object dog essentially. We could write this in some sort of a textual notation as is been done by Charniak and McDermott. So, if you look up their book, you will see that essentially. So, that is the basic path. So far we have made sense of John hit dog. Now, obviously, you can see that some sort of a memory would be required, where you would have temporarily stored the word his and little. You are unable to make sense of them, because unless you know what is going to follow essentially. So, you need some memory where you will temporarily store stuff and then process it again essentially. So, let us see how the other two words are handled. The word little is a picture aider, it is a adjective, and it has a relation which we will call as attributive dependency. So, it is a attribute of the dog essentially. So, it is not just the dog, it is a little dog. His is a little bit more complex, because first of all it is a pronoun. So, we have to find out that it refers to John, and secondly it denotes a dependency here which is called prepositional dependency, which is in this case possessed by essentially. So, we add as another kind of an attribute, you might say, that the dog is the dog which is possessed by John essentially. Okay. So, these are the kind of conceptualizations that we will be talking about. What we have just seen, for example, is that John hit. So, a PP can do an act essentially, that is one form of conceptualizations, certain PPs can act, or with those three lined arrows, double arrows, we can say that PP and a picture area can form a conceptualization. So, for example, I would say John is tall, then I have a conceptualization essentially. So, the first one is talking about an action, the second one is talking about a state essentially. So, they are stative in that sense. Then acts will have objects, as we have already seen that John hit his little dog. Acts may have a sense of direction, for example, John went to the canteen. Acts may have recipients, for example, John gave a book to Mary. Acts may have instrumental acts essentially, that there may be a high level act and there must be maybe a low level act which is instrumental in carrying out the high level act. We will see examples as we go along essentially. So, I have mentioned some examples here, but these are things that we will introduce as we go along. M-trans is mental transfer. It requires conceptualizations have objects, and M-build has its own object type essentially. So, essentially the instrumental act can be M-trans essentially. We will see about this as we go along. Acts can have instruments which are instrumental acts. PPs can describe by the conceptualizations in which they occur. For example, the dog who was watching the water flow by or something like that. So, which dog? The dog who was watching that particular event essentially. Likewise, you could be watching a state essentially. So, the dog who was watching the sunset, well, if you can think of that as a state. They can have times. So, conceptualization can happen at specific times, and they can have locations essentially. Where did this event happen? Then something more interesting. So, we can have causal relationships. So, the conceptualization, as you can see on the top here, oops, okay, leave it. The conceptualization. So, we are talking about this number 11 here. So, a conceptual act causes a state change essentially. So, what we see below that is essentially state change. So, let me try this once again. So, this is the conceptualization. This triple arrow is a causal relation between the conceptualization, and this stands for state change. So, we have a causal relation between some act and a state change. So, if you do something, then as a result of it something may happen. So, if I drink of this bottle of water, then the bottle of water may become empty essentially. Likewise, conceptualization can result be reasons for other conceptualizations. So, John shouted at Mary, and therefore Mary hit him, or something like that. One conceptualization can be a reason for another conceptualization. Likewise, states can cause conceptualizations to happen, events to happen. So, the first one, which is this, says that a state causes some event. So, for example, he called the fire department because he saw the burning house or something like that. So, there was he saw the burning house and therefore, he called the fire department, or you can see some state change because the water was leaking from the tank and the tank was becoming empty. So, he called the plumber or something like that essentially. Then conceptualizations. So, concepts can be related to other concepts. So, for example, you might say something like here John is John. No. So, John is a doctor or something like that essentially. And acts can have action aiders that we have already seen or we will see again. Then we have this notion of state variables essentially. Okay. So, we have talked about conceptualizations and actions, but we have to talk about states essentially. So, they have a small vocabulary for states. So, for example, there is a variable called health essentially, and it goes from -10 to +10 essentially. So, what you see a list of words and phrases: dead, gravely ill, sick, under the water, all right, tip top, perfect health. As you can see, they map to different values of this variable called health essentially. So, the basic idea is that everything that is talking about health will eventually get mapped onto this variable called health. So, his state of health was -3 and then he had some medicine and his state of health became +2. So, we do not want to talk about he was ill and then he became well essentially, but instead we want to talk about the same set of variables, because the smaller the set of predicates you have, the lesser the rules of inference you will need essentially. So, physical state is similar to health, except that it applies to any inanimate objects. So, or it could be animate objects. So, dead, harmed, injured, broken, and so on. Then anger goes from -10 to 0, and you could map various words like furious, enraged, angry, or upset or calm to different values in this state variables. Mental state, which is also called joy in some of their implementations, one in particular implementation called Margie, goes from -10 to +10. So, at the -10 level you may be catatonic or depressed, or on the positive side you may be happy or ecstatic. This all will get mapped onto something called mental state or joy, depending on which implementation you are looking at. Fear goes from -10 to 0, terrified, scared, anxious, calm. Consciousness goes from 0 to +10. So, from unconscious to awake, which is 10, and maybe something more than 10, I do not know, if you have some higher level of consciousness. Surprise can go from 0 to 10, surprise, amazed, and astounded, and so on. Hunger can go from -10 to +10. So, all the different phrases that you can think of, which we will talk about, being hungry, being satisfied or stuffed or ravenous or could eat a horse, all will get mapped onto some value essentially. Disgust can go from -10 to 0. So, revolted, disgusted, bothered, all these things. Then you can combine these variables to form what you might call as compound variables. So, shocked could mean that surprise level is high and disgust level is negatively high essentially. Calm, or as you might say cool, would be that there is no surprise, there is no disgust. So, you might talking about somebody like a Buddhist monk here, no fear, no anger, but consciousness level is higher than 0 essentially. So, I will just show you an example of this program called Margie, and what you see as the input is a sentence which was parsed. So, it is not just the work of one person, but a whole team of people working on that. So, if the input was John told Mary that Bill wants a book, then the program could make sense of that sentence, parse it into conceptual dependency, and then generate outputs which are kind of randomly generated paraphrases or questions out of that. So, it might say a book about what, Mary knows that Bill wants a book, Bill wants to come to have a book. All this come from the fact that you are reading a sentence and you have some world knowledge about this. So, if you want a book, that you want to have the book, that kind of very explicit detail can be worked out essentially. You can also make plausible inferences like John wants to read a book essentially. Now, it is not said anywhere, all that is said is that John told Mary that Bill wants a book, but we are kind of making use of our world knowledge to say that Bill wants to read the book essentially. So, here is another example. John gave Mary a beating with a stick, and so obviously you can infer that a stick touched Mary, Mary became hurt, John wanted Mary to become hurt. You might even ask why was John angry essentially. Okay, so I will stop here. In the next class, we will continue by looking at conceptual dependency theory, and in fact, we will continue by looking at some inferences that Margie can make, and then move on to how to represent different kinds of concepts essentially. Okay.